Hello, this is the second video or second series of videos in the Learn to Knit series. The first project that we worked on was for a pattern called Grandmother's Favorite Dishcloth. And if you have not already done that project, I encourage you to go back and do that project first. That project is going to give you the foundation for some of the things that we're doing in this video. I will have a little bit of review in this video, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the things that we already learned in the first project. So this is intended to build on top of the skills learned in the first video. So again, the first project should have been Grandmother's Favorite Dishcloth, and this is the second project. The name of this pattern is called Open Star Dishcloth. The designer of this pattern is unknown. The pattern calls for a ball of cotton yarn, and I am using this Peaches and Cream yarn. If you can find Sugar and Cream in the store, that's almost identical to Peaches and Cream. Either yarn would be suitable. The pattern also calls for size 8, US 8 knitting needles, and I am going to use a size 7 instead, just because my US 8 needles already have a project on them, and my size 7 needles are free. What does that do? Okay, you can substitute needles, but if you go down a needle size, it is going to make your fabric denser, thicker. If you go up a needle size, it's going to make the fabric looser and more drapey. If you go up several needle sizes, it will make the fabric a lot looser, a lot drapier. The entire dimensions of the project will be bigger. So, you want to stick as close to the pattern recommendations as possible, at least when you're first starting out with knitting. But I am going to go off the beaten path a little bit here. So in our last project, the instructions told us to cast on 4 stitches. And when we cast on 4 stitches, we were able to just, start with our slip knot, not too far from the end of the yarn. But this pattern, we need to cast on 39 stitches. Well, with a long tail cast on, you might recall that you make a slip knot, and you have your tail yarn and your working yarn in a slingshot, and therefore you have yarn coming from both the tail yarn and the ball of yarn to create your cast on stitches. So when you have a large number of stitches, you want to have enough yarn in your tail to be able to create all of the stitches you need for your cast on. So how do you know how much yarn you need? Well, a good rule of thumb is to leave a little bit of a tail, something like 4 to 6 inches, and then just start wrapping the yarn around your needle. I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Okay, since the pattern calls for 39 stitches, it's close enough to 40, where I'm going to stop at 20, and I'm going to pull that yarn off, and I'm going to pay attention to where I started wrapping it. And if I double that, I don't know if you can tell what I'm doing here, if I double that, now that should be enough to cast on 40 stitches. So I am going to tie my slip knot there. If you don't remember how to do a slip knot, go back and watch video 1 of Grandma's Favorite Dishcloth. And in this video, we need to cast on 39 stitches. So I'll go slow for the first few, and then I'm just going to do it. So you might recall you have the tail end of your yarn facing you. The piece of yarn that goes to the ball is facing away from you. You're going to take your thumb and your forefinger and you're going to put it in between those two strands of yarn, and then with the rest of your fingers you're just going to wrap them around both strands of yarn. Then you pivot your hand backwards. You don't want to twist your hand or tilt it or anything like that. You're just going from it being in a downward position with the knitting needle in between to pivoting your hand back so that you have a slingshot formation. Then with that needle, you're going to go underneath the yarn that is coming off the front of your thumb, and you're going to come up in between the two strands of yarn that are on the thumb. You're going to swing that needle around and grab the yarn that's attached to your index finger, and then push the needle down in between those two strands of yarn on the thumb again, so that now you have 2 stitches on the knitting needle. You're going to drop with your thumb and then snug that yarn back up again. I'll do another one slowly. Up underneath the front strand of yarn on the thumb, and in between, the needle comes back up in between both of the strands on the thumb, swings around to just grab a hold of that yarn on the index finger, and back down in between the 2 strands of yarn on the thumb. Now we have 3 strands on the needle, and I'm going to snug that up. So I am just going to continue. If those instructions weren't clear, if you're still struggling with it, you can either rewind the video and go back, or you can go back and watch the first video in the Grandmother's Favorite Dishcloth series, and I spend a little bit more time explaining how that goes. So I'm done casting on my stitches. Before I start the pattern, I am going to count to make sure that I have the appropriate number of stitches. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28, 30, 32, 34, 36, 38, 39. So yes, we need 39 stitches. So it's always worth it to take a moment and count the stitches, make sure they're right, verify by double checking your pattern. Yes, I have the appropriate number of stitches on. It is a shame to not do that step and then start your instructions for the next row, and then come to find out you get all the way to the end of the row and the instructions continue and you've run out of stitches. Or the other thing that can happen is you start across the row and you complete the instruction and there are still more unworked stitches left on the left needle. That's always an indicator that something wrong happened on the row before. So take the time, count the stitches before you continue on. So I have taken this cast on, this needle that was in my right hand for the cast on, I'm turning it around, sticking it in my left hand, and picking up the needle with my right hand, the empty needle. I am going to scooch my stitches down, scooch them down so that they stop just before the needle starts to taper here at the end. And you want to squish them up pretty good so that they're easier to work as you encounter them. I'm going to hold my working yarn in my left hand, and there's not a need to drop that yarn, so let's hang on to it, keep it easily accessible. And we're going to take a look at the instructions for row 1 of the pattern. Now row 1 says knit 2, then it has an asterisk, and it says yarn over, knit 3, pass the first of these 3 stitches over the other 2, another asterisk, repeat to last stitch, and then knit 1. So all of the instructions that we see in between the asterisks are the repeat section. So really we just knit 2 at the beginning, and then we keep repeating the instructions that are in the middle of the asterisks over and over and over again. And then at the end of that repeat section, I should have 1 stitch remaining, and I'm going to knit it. So let's give this a try. As you may recall, with your knit stitch, you're going to stick your right needle into the left hand side of the first stitch on your left needle, wrap it, pull that yarn through, and slip the stitch off. Repeat that. If you're rusty on your knit stitch, go back to the video lessons for Grandma's favorite dishcloth. Okay, so we have knit 2. Now we're getting into the asterisk section. It says to do a yarn over. You remember a yarn over simply puts the yarn on the left, that's on in your left hand, and places it over the knitting needle or the right hand knitting needle without you inserting it first into a stitch. So then I've done my yarn over, and then I have to knit 3. 1. Oops. I'm going to try that one again. Okay, and then pass the first of those stitches. So here's the first of the group of 3. Pass it over the other 2. So I am going to use my left hand finger to kind of hold those stitches on while I slip that stitch over them. Okay, so the result is, what we have here is the 2 knit stitches. This is our yarn over, and this is our 3 stitches. We have the first one, it has been passed over the other 2. So we have to repeat that over and over again until we get to the last stitch of this row. Okay, so we're going to take the left needle, slip it into that 3rd stitch. With my left index finger, I'm holding on to those other stitches so they don't fall off the needle as I pass that stitch over them. Okay, yarn over, knit 1, 2, 3, pass 1. It is fiddly. These are fiddly instructions, but it gives you the effect that we're after in the end. So you just have to tolerate the fiddliness. And I will even go out on a limb and say that when you force yourself to do things that are fiddly like this, you end up developing techniques that make it easy for you. Like the technique I'm showing you here, where I use that left hand index finger to make sure those other stitches don't fall off. Well, I learned that through trial and error when I've done other passing stitch over other stitches. So, you know, I would say that don't shy away from stitches that are fiddly and difficult to do. Just face them. Keep doing it, and in the end, you'll just get good at it, and it will be less and less fiddly, and you will be less and less afraid to tackle patterns that have that particular stitch or particular technique in it. I remember when I was a fairly new knitter, there was this particular shawl that I wanted to make so bad. And it had this one stitch in it that I found to be very, very difficult. And unfortunately, well, I guess, you know, in retrospect, fortunately, it had that stitch in the design over and over and over and over again. I can't even tell you how many times I did that stitch. I would have to say probably hundreds of times before my project was complete. And you know what? I got really good at doing that stitch by the end of that project. And now I think nothing of it when I come across that stitch in a pattern. It's just like, okay, it's fiddly, but I know my technique and I don't mind doing it at all anymore. I've found a way to make it easier for me. And how did I discover that? By just doing it over and over and over again until it was just less difficult for me. So this is going to feel tedious. I have the feeling, especially for new knitters, that it's going to be particularly frustrating. Right now, see, I'm struggling with this a little bit. I think I spread these stitches out a little bit too much, so it was causing me to have to try to stretch the stitch even further than was necessary on the passing over of it. Okay, I'm getting closer to the end of this row. Don't forget your yarn overs in between your knit 3 past the first stitch over the last 2. If you're not seeing, when you spread them out, if you're not seeing this type of a configuration, then you're probably forgetting your yarn overs. So I have my knit 2, yarn over, this is the slip stitch combo, yarn over, slip stitch combo, yarn over, slip stitch combo, over and over and over and over and over again. Okay, so again I'm going to yarn over, going to knit 3, pass this one over, yarn over, knit 3. Okay, so I can already see that I have 4 stitches left over here. So by the time I get my 3 knit, I'll have 1 left on the left needle, which is exactly what I was going for. That's how I know that A, I have the correct number of knit stitches, and B, that I followed the instructions well enough on this row where I knit into the appropriate number of stitches. Okay, so next row, rows 2 and row 4, so they don't repeat it, they just tell you the instructions once, and you need to know that as you're knitting, you're going to go from row 1 to row 2 to row 3, and then back to the instructions for row 2 because you got to stick row 4 in there. Okay, so row 4 is purl. We are just going to purl across all of these stitches. I'm squishing them down toward the end of the needle. I'm holding on to this tip just to make sure I don't squish them off. You don't want to go that far with it. And to purl, you are going to stick your right hand needle from right to left through the front of the stitch on the left needle. I'm going to wrap it with my working yarn, pull that wrapped stitch through, and then slide the whole thing off. Again, stick the needle in from right to left in the front of the needle. Notice with our knit stitches, we always have the working yarn in the back. Well, for purl stitches, your working yarn needs to be in the front. So we're gonna stab through that, wrap it, pull through, slide it off. Stab through, wrap it, pull through, slide it off. Oops. There we go. Purl stitch. From right to the left in front, wrap it, pull the yarn through and slide it off. So when the row simply says purl, that means that you're going to do the same thing to every single stitch in the row. You're just going to purl every stitch until you get to the end. Conversely, if the instructions simply said knit, that would mean that you knit every stitch till you got to the end of the row. So I'm going to pause this. I'm going to get to the end of the row and I'll meet you back here when we're ready to start row 3. Put it in my left hand, grab the empty needle with my right hand. Make sure that it's the working yarn that you hold in your hand and not your tail yarn. You want to be starting to knit with that. Okay, and then the next row, the instructions say knit 1, and then we see the asterisk, knit 3, pass the first of these 3 stitches over the other 2, and then yarn over. We're going to do this all the way to the last 2 stitches. Repeat that set of instructions until we get to the last 2 stitches, and then we're going to knit 2. Okay, so knit 1, and we're going to knit 3, 1, 2, 3, pass the first of those 3 over the other 2, and then yarn over. I'll repeat that, knit 3, and pass the first of the 3 over the other 2. And we continue in this fashion until we get to the last 2 stitches, and we're just going to knit those last 2. Now I will say that I think part of the reason why this might be a little more difficult for me is that I am using a smaller needle than the pattern called for. It might not be quite as fiddly if I was using the appropriate size needle. Maybe it wouldn't be as tight. If you were sort of cheating like I am, know that the tight factor, I guess I'm going to call it, may be due to using needle sizes that are smaller than the recommended size. So I'm just going to continue in this fashion until I get to the end of this row, and then I will be back. So I'm doing the last set of the repeat. I knit 3, pass the first stitch over the other 2, and then I yarn over, and then knit 2 stitches. Okay, now we can see that the little angled thread is from our passing a stitch over. It's offset from row to row, like that. So as we continue on in that fashion, it's going to do the same thing. So I'm turning it around, putting the needle with all the stitches in my left hand, putting the empty needle in my right hand, and we are purling, so our working yarn will be in the front of the work, and I'm going to stab through the front of that stitch from right to left, wrap my working yarn around it, and pull that through, slide it off. And we're going to do this until the end of the row. So I'm not going to make you continue to watch this because it's all the same thing. When you get to the end of row 4, you are just going to go back to the instructions for row 1. You're going to knit rows 1 through 4 9 more times. And I will just show you that when I encounter a pattern that asks me to do that, what I will do for myself to help me keep better track is I take a piece of paper and I put the row numbers down. And then as I knit each row, I just put a tally mark. And then next row, next row, next row. And then I can tell exactly how many I've done so far and how many I have left. Just as, obviously I am skipping through this very, very fast, but this is the technique I use to make sure that I knit all of the pattern repeats that it says. So if I get to the point where I have 9 tally marks next to every row, then I know I've completed my entire dishcloth. And it says to bind off in purl. So when we've bound off before in Grandma's favorite dishcloth, we bound off in knit stitch. So I will come back once I have all 9 of my repeats done, and I will show you how to bind off in purl. Okay, so I am back. I have all of my repeats done for the pattern, and the last instruction for the pattern is to bind off and purl, I believe is how they put it. Another way that you commonly see that stated in patterns is bind off purlwise. A lot of instructions will say things like slip a stitch knitwise or slip a stitch purlwise, bind off knitwise or bind off purlwise. So basically all that means is you do it in the same fashion that you would purl. So for a bind off, we are going to do it just like we did for binding off knitwise, except we're using purl stitches. So I've inserted my needle in as if to purl. I'm going to purl my first stitch, and then I purl a second stitch. From there, it's just like before. You're just going to slip your left needle into the first stitch on your right needle, and oops. Let me try that again, and slip it over the second stitch. Purl the second stitch, and you're going to slip that one over. Purl another stitch, and slip it over. Purl another stitch, and slip it over. So you just continue in this fashion until all of the stitches on the row have been bound off. You can see that we're starting to get a nice little bind off edge there. On your grandmother's favorite dishcloth, we only had 4 stitches to bind off, so you didn't get a lot of bind off practice. And it was a little loosey-goosey because we had that eyelet edging going around the whole thing. But on this one, you will get to see a nice bind off edge. Looks nice and clean. So yeah, nice and clean edge. So I am just going to continue binding off each of my stitches. And there we have it. So the last stitch has been bound off. I have 1 stitch remaining on the needle. I'm just going to pull that and take my scissors, cut it, pull it out, and there you go. Then as always, to finish it off, you take your tapestry needle giving me a hard time about threading through. It's a very thick yarn, really, this cotton stuff. And I probably could have chosen a better, thicker, better needle with a more open eye. Anyway, I'm not going to take your time up on that. But I would take my tapestry needle and I would weave in my ends, probably on the back of the work. With grandmother's favorite dishcloth, the front and the back of the work looked identical because we were knitting in garter stitch. Garter stitch means that you knit on both sides of the work. And this project, we were knitting on the front side, or in knitting we call it the right side of the work, and we purled on the back side, or the wrong side of the work. You might also notice that my cast-on edge, it is a little narrower than my bind-off edge. Okay, and there's a perfectly logical reason for this. Totally my fault. I just got looser as I went with my knitting. In the beginning, I was pulling my stitches sort of tight. I was really struggling to do that past the slips, or past the stitch over the other two stitches. And as a result, it was just, hard and tedious. And as I went, I just got a little looser with it so that it would be easier for me to work the stitches. And that's why I ended up with this misshapen piece of work in the end. It's not terrible, but to the naked eye, it is noticeable. I could wet this down, pin it out so it's perfectly straight and perfect dimensions on both sides, and let it dry, and it would stay that way until, of course, I got it wet. And since this is supposed to be a dishcloth or a washcloth, you're going to get it wet. I would say that since it's a dishcloth or a washcloth, who cares if it's a little misshapen? I really don't care. If this was, something else like a blanket or something, you'd want it to look the right shape. Anyway, I have to say I am a fan of how this stitch pattern looks in this yarn. It turned out looking really cute. This one is Peaches and Cream. What do they call this color? They just have a number, 14117. Anyway, I think that it turned out cute. So for those of you who are trying project number 2, the Open Star dishcloth, I wish you luck, and I hope that you are happy with this project in the end. And I look forward to teaching you how to do project number 3. God bless.